Rob Lucky Budd is a rock musician and sound technician turned audio archivist who has a grad degree in history, oral history being his passion. He is the author of a book filled with BC's oral history. It's called Voices of British Columbia. It is my pleasure to welcome Rob Lucky Budd to Studio 4 to tell us more. How'd you get the name Lucky?
That one's an easy story. That one I have no problem telling. When I was born, I was the youngest of four, and it went boy, girl, boy, and I was thought to be a girl. And so my oldest brother, Adam, named me Lucky when I was 2 days old, because he felt lucky to have another brother, and the name stuck. And when I was about 4 years old, my mom got a phone call from the kindergarten saying, "We're having problems with your son, Rob. He doesn't listen. We're not really sure what to do with him." And my mom said, "Who?" "Oh, just call him Lucky. He has no idea that you're talking to him." So I've been called Lucky for my entire life.
That's a great story.
Yeah.
So the teacher's saying, "Why are you not listening to me?
Yeah.
You didn't know your name was Rob."
I had no idea.
But now you do. What started you on this journey, the Voices of British Columbia?
In 2000, the CBC started an initiative to digitize all of their audio holdings that were spread out across all the provincial archives and territorial archives across Canada. And I had a reputation in Victoria from my rock musician days as the guy who records things. So I got a call one day saying, "Hey, we have this huge collection here. We need someone to copy it to CD, in some cases get the tapes to actually play. Would you like to do it?" And I remember pulling the phone away from my face and thinking to myself, am I really this lucky? Yeah, I would love to do it. And it just so happens that within that huge collection that we have at the BC Archives of CBC material was one of the largest oral history collections in the world, the Orchard Collection. And I knew nothing about it before I started, so I stumbled into it.
Imbert? Is it Imbert Orchard?
Imbert Orchard.
Imbert Orchard
Yeah.
Collection. He's gone now.
He is. He died in
But he did a
1991.
great thing, a grand thing.
He did. From 1959 to 1966, he went around British Columbia with a sound technician and interviewed 998 first-generation British Columbians or First Nations people for a collection totaling 2,700 hours of material, which is just unbelievable. It took me 4 years to listen to this stuff.
I'm
And
sure.
with the headphones on every day, you're listening to the stories of the men, the women, the homesteaders, the ranchers, the captains,
The remittance men.
everybody. And you get so deeply into their lives, I thought to myself, I can't just leave this in the archive. I just can't. So I thought, I need to get this material out to the public in the form of a book.
Sure.
How am I going to do that? So I went to the history department at UVic and I pleaded with them. I have this experience of BC history that no one will ever come to you with. I really want to learn how to study and use oral history. And so eventually they let me in and I did my master's degree focusing on oral history and more specifically on this collection and how it could be used, what it is, what it isn't, and how it can be used by the public. And now the result of that is this book.
Well, as you know, in First Nations, much of the tradition is oral.
Yeah.
And so it's not, their history is not written down.
Exactly.
Ours has, some of it has been written and some of it hasn't. So Imbert Orchard and a recording engineer, Ian Stephen, got together, did all the groundwork for you. 1,000 pioneers later.
Amazing.
Or more. How many?
998.
998, so 1,000.
Yeah.
Running pack trains through rugged passes and some of the women. Some of those tough women
Absolutely.
in the day. Tell me about Sarah Glassy. I like her.
Sarah Glassy is probably my favorite that I've included in this entire book. Sarah Glassy was the first woman who ever preempted and owned land in British Columbia. Now what preemption is back in the early 1900s, the government would give you 160 acres of land, and all you had to do was improve the land, meaning clear some of it, build
Right.
a house, and they would give you that land. And in 1911, women were given the right to do so. And this woman, Sarah Glassy, who was originally from Spokane, Washington, went up the Skeena River and she took out a preemption. And all the people there thought, we're never going to see this woman ever again. She's just a woman. There's no way she's going to do this. And she is a real pioneer, the first woman to ever own land in British Columbia. And
Sarah Glassy.
Yeah.
And, well, she carried a rifle.
she carried a
And
rifle.
could bag a bird.
That's exactly what she said. She said she bagged more birds than any man in the Kispiox Valley. But what's amazing about her is that the history of British Columbia, the way it's been told, has very few characters. We have James Douglas, Amor de Cosmos, Judge Begbie. What you get through oral histories, like this one specifically on Sarah Glassy, is that heroes come from ordinary people. I mean, there's a woman who is so important to the story of our province who, if they weren't recorded, we would have no idea. And we get to hear it in her own words what that was like for her.
That must have been amazing.
Amazing.
Going back in time, the great chief, Chief Hua
Hua.
of Fort St. James, saved James Douglas, governor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, at that time, in the 1830s and 1820s, James Douglas, before he was the governor of Vancouver Island, was the chief factor for the Hudson's Bay Company. And their fort was at Fort St. James. And there was a murder that happened of one of the non-native people, who then the Europeans then went and killed somebody on the reserve, and there was this whole to-do thing, and a bunch of the people wanted to get revenge. And so they went and they found James Douglas, and they put a knife to his neck. And one of the men said, "Shall I strike?" to Chief Qua, and he said, "No, you shouldn't. You shouldn't. You should let him go." And these are, again, the stories and anecdotes that give us so much character. And that story is in the book, told by Qua's granddaughter.
How great.
Amazing.
Yeah, countless women came, as you know, often with the men, and they hated it here.
Hated it. Hated it. A really good juxtaposition to Sarah Glassy is the story of Mrs. H. Williams, whose story is also in the book. Now, we look at Mrs. H. Williams, we don't know her first name, and we know that Harry Williams was her husband, so she took on his name, just like so many countless women who would have come here around the turn of the century.
Sure.
And she hated it. She came from Scotland, and she ended up in this place in the East Kootenays, had a terrible time, and when you listen to her story 30, 40 years later, she's laughing the entire time. The entire time she's laughing, she's saying, "God, I hated it. At one point, I thought a crocodile was after me, and I was so cold." And
A crocodile
I cried every
in
day.
British Columbia.
Exactly. I cried every day for a year, and over time, she did eventually learn to like it. But there's so many different experiences for all the people who came.
Do you remember the story of Nellie Baker?
Very well.
Tell me about her.
Nellie Baker was a child growing up in the Caribou, and her and her brother found that they were very bored, and they used to corral the wild horses running around in the Caribou-Thompson area. And there was this one story that she tells when a bunch of the horses got away, and they went down to the native rancherie about 10 miles away. And her brother as children went and they got these horses, and they swam them up the Thompson River to get them home.
Forded the Thompson.
Up the Thompson River.
Up
And
the
all the native
Thompson.
people were like, "You guys are crazy, you're never going to make it." And looking back all these years later, she says, "I can't believe that we had the courage to be able to do something
So
like
are you
that."
around Ashcroft, somewhere in there where the Bonaparte Ranch is?
That's exactly where she was born.
Bonaparte
on the
Ranch and the
Bonaparte Ranch.
Chataway and the Highland Valley Cattle
And the nice
Company.
thing about this book actually is that all the stories are situated with a map that we included. So I don't know if we can see this or not.
Right.
But for every story that we're going to look at, you're always situated on the map. So if you're looking at the Bonaparte Ranch, we can see it's right in there, and you can actually see that kind of thing.
Yeah,
So,
it's so great.
yeah, and so how this book works, and what I was really going for, was a three-dimensional type of history. The book comes along with 3 CDs, so you can actually listen along to the stories in the people's own words. An introduction by me.
And the CDs, it's the people talking?
It's actual people talking. And so you get a little introduction by me, so that if you don't know anything about what they're about to talk about, you have enough context that you can then listen to or read along with the story, and it'll absolutely make sense. And the other thing about the book is it has over 80 archival photos. So it really makes it come to life.
And the photos are spectacular, by the way. Who did the photos?
I went into the provincial archives and went through about 1,600.
So many different people, obviously.
Yeah. I went through about 1,600 photos to pull out the 80 or so that are used in the book. And you really get a three-dimensional sense for the atmosphere and the history.
And the outfits, like climbing the Rockies, the mountaineers, the costumes.
Yeah.
Well, survival costumes, I suspect, but the legendary figures, of course, Billy Miner, famous bank robber.
Yeah, he was actually the only successful train robber in the history of Canada.
He was called the Gentleman Bandit.
Yeah, he never used a gun. Never used a gun, but he was the one apparently who originated the phrase "hands up."
Really?
Yeah, and that's pretty. It's
Hands
pretty
up,
amazing
please.
story. Yeah, exactly, kind of his
Hands
thing.
up, please.
And never shot anybody, but successfully robbed 3 trains, 2 in Canada, 1 in the States, and got caught on the 4th attempt right outside of Kamloops.
Yes, I saw a wonderful movie.
Yeah, The Grey Fox.
The Grey Fox.
Yeah.
He was a modern-day Robin Hood, really, sort of.
Yeah, the story
I guess
is,
we could go there.
Yeah, the story is that he built an ice skating rink for all the children around Princeton with some of his money, and he would be reputed to go and buy pails of candy for all the children before they'd go to school and say, "Hey, take as many as you want." And all of those stories are in here.
And there's warrior chiefs in here, and riverboat passengers, and it's saloon talk. Because so much of the camaraderie, well, still does, I suppose, but in those days, people hung out in bars.
Yeah.
Some did.
Yeah. Well, there's a really good story of a man named Roger Monteith who talks about the early days of Victoria. And one of the ways that he talks about it is you'd run into somebody on the street, and of course we'll go in for a drink, so they'd say, or in his own, parlance of his language. And yeah, it's amazing just the atmosphere you get for the pace of life.
Were there can-can girls and things like that? Was there a Miss Kitty?
Not that he mentions, but you got to think that they were probably there.
I suspect, whatever we call them, can-can girls, I think would work. But the brown jug?
Yep. The Garrick's Head pub, which is still in Victoria.
Right.
The Grotto. All these old pubs, and some of them are still there.
Yeah, it's a real tribute to the CBC, keeping these stories.
Yeah, I really think so.
And a tribute to you, meeting the mule skinners along the way.
Absolutely.
I'm sure. Remittance men. Now tell me, how did you become a remittance man? Why were they called that?
A remittance man was someone who was sent over from England and given a remittance or an allowance by their father to live in British Columbia. A lot of the time, the way that inheritance worked back in those days is that the father would give their eldest son the inheritance. So in order to kind of get rid of the other kids, they would give them allowances or remittances to live in other places. And so you had a lot of people living in the Okanagan or around Vancouver who were known as remittance men, and they would basically live off their father's money. And some of them didn't amount to too much.
We call them trust fund babies.
That's what we call them nowadays.
Trustafarians, something like that. Were there remittance women? You never hear of
You never hear the remittance women. No, I think because of the whole inheritance thing, women tend to be married off by the fathers back in those days. But you meet some very colorful remittance men in British Columbia's history, and through this book you're able to do so as well.
What was the fun part of this for you, the fun part? Like playing rock and roll, I know is fun for you.
That's pretty fun. The fun part of this for me is every step of the process. It was amazing for me to sit in the studio with the headphones on, getting involved in the lives of these people. And then as I was able to transform it into something that could be functional for everybody in the province by crafting this book, that was a pleasure. And while I was doing it along the way, I got a call from a woman in Edmonton who said, "I hear you're the oral history guy. My husband's had a fascinating life. Would you like to come and record him and do a memoir?" And so I've started a business called Memories to Memoirs, where I get hired, the way that Orchard did, by families to interview and record family members and put together books of memoirs based on people's lives. And the way that I do it as well is also along with compact discs and CDs. So 60, 70 years down the road from now, you can hear the story of your great-great-grandfather, your great-great-uncle in their own words.
Sure, and that's a marvelous idea, as you know, because when they pass, go to the other side and we say, what was that Grandpa did in the war?
Yeah,
and well, he
and
fought.
here you have it.
But do you remember the battalion? And no one does, because in my case, I'm the oldest in the family living.
Yeah.
So we always thought we should have.
Well, exactly.
We should have recorded.
Exactly.
In their own words, I know a friend of mine, the late Mary Stewart, she lived in Ashcroft, and they had such great stories about the history up there.
Yeah, and once these people go, you lose all of that. And everyone's family has, an Aunt Martha or an Uncle Kenny or whatever it might be who has the stories remembered from what their parents told them.
Frontier justice, the hanging judge.
Yeah, I worked with a woman in Vancouver who could remember her family story back to the 1820s when they first came to Canada from England.
Wow.
Because her great-grandparents had told her. And again, she's in her 90s now.
And then when you die, you could use it at your funeral. You could maybe do your own eulogy.
Yeah, you
Hello, I'm gone.
I actually had the opportunity to do that with one client. Actually, the client who I did this book on, after he passed, he was 94 years old. I was able to play bits of his story at his funeral, and everyone could hear in his own words how he felt about his own life.
How great. So. What's the name of your band?
I'm in several right now. Canadian Beauty is the one that I'm pushing right now.
Canadian Beauty. Okay, nice to meet you.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
Robert Lucky Budd, Voices of British Columbia, Stories from Our Frontier.